Good evening. Welcome to the Nantucket Historical Association's Food for Thought lecture series. My name is Jocelyn Wong, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator here at the NHA. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'll go over the format of the event. So first we will hear a talk, and then we will move into our Q&A session. If you have a question, you can submit it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So this evening, I am delighted to host Kayci Merritte. Kayci was the 2022 E. Geoffrey and Elizabeth Thayer Verney Fellow at the NHA. Her trips to the NHA Research Library focused on recovering narratives from the archive about Black people as they were found in spaces ranging from the historic whaleship to the still forming spaces of tourism on Nantucket. Her research was informed by a variety of materials, including personal letters, newspaper clippings, ship's logs, postcards, and tourist manuals. This research fits into her broader academic work focused on notions of Black space and place. Kayci is a PhD candidate in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. Without further ado, welcome, Kayci.
Awesome. Thank you, Jocelyn. And as I start to share my screen, let's see, share. All right. Also want to thank the Nantucket Historical Association generally and the Verney Fellowship for supporting my research on Nantucket. And just a special thank you to Amelia Holmes and Peggy Godwin in the library for helping me collect all of my very heavy boxes of materials. So, as the title of my talk indicates, I will be reviewing some materials that I found in the Nantucket Historical Association archive with a particular focus on Black life. So what we find in the Nantucket archive are glimpses of Black life throughout the centuries. There are single name heroes, and there are broad questions about Black people on the island. For example, there are questions about abolition and questions about integration. And through the different representational modes in which Black people appear in the Nantucket archive, it, like many or most archives in America, renders the Black person to a position of presence. So this is the position of being the observed, of being noted, of being discussed. Those who are present are not the creators, the writers, are in control of the narratives recorded about them, and they were not the ones directing a first-person primary perspective. Presence is the Black person who is represented in the background of media representations, or in this case, archival representations. This person may be briefly, loosely, or momentarily part of the story being told, but it is not their story. They are in view, but they may be rendered unnoticed, if not almost invisible. They are mere mentions in the story, a story observed and told by someone else, often about someone else or something else. The scarcity of Black people in archives and the paucity of information that may be attached to their appearance is worthy of critique. When Black presence is found, however, it is important to explore the person or people and the story that can be garnered about them. So while it is apparent that there are limitations to the archive, we can recognize that they are incomplete, it is nonetheless worthwhile to investigate and analyze what can be found. So again, there's not necessarily a dominant Black viewpoint, perspective, or self-authored Black narrative in the Nantucket archive. And so as I look through the materials in the archive, if I came across a document that had this so-called Black presence, I took note of it, as in I scanned it, I documented it, I photographed it. And so I will discuss some of these sightings in this talk. Though the following documents that I will discuss have been found in the Nantucket archive, the Black presence or person I look at may not necessarily have a personal relationship to Nantucket. So progressing through the archive starting in the early 1800s, I will consider the ways in which Black people appear, which is not infrequently in the background, as a glimpse, as presence, perhaps even as an afterthought, and bring them into focus from the larger narrative that is being told. So the first object I'll look at is a newspaper clipping from 1811. In this fragment of newspaper, we find two coincidental and competing views of the African American, one on the front of the clipping and one on the back of the clipping. And as you can see, there's sort of a mirror imaging of this clipping that shows the front and back. There's the exceptional man and the abject man, the ship captain and owner, and the runaway enslaved person. They are both written about, as the narratives were told about them, coincidentally by chance, printed back to back. The article of interest for the Nantucket archive was that of Captain Paul Cuffey, who had a relationship with Nantucket because he delivered goods to the island during the Revolutionary War. The article informs the reader about how an American brig named the Traveler arrived in Liverpool, England from Sierra Leone. It was captained by Paul Cuffey, who was the son of an African enslaved person. Notably, all of the ship's crew were also Black. The article goes on to give a brief biography of Captain Cuffey's upbringing, including his, quote, assiduousness in learning maritime navigation and shipbuilding, and his religious instruction in Quakerism. On his trip with the Traveler, he brought a man from Sierra Leone to England and had him learn navigation along the way, of which, according to the article, quote, he has learned surprisingly fast and shows that intellect is by no means controlled by the color of the skin, and that the Blacks are worthy of being the brethren of the fortunately more cultivated whites, end quote. Cuffey's appearance and general affect are then described. On the other side of this article, we find a runaway slave advertisement. It reads, quote, a Negro man named James Ambley, age 26 or thereabouts, 5 feet 8 or 9 inches high, is much pitted with the smallpox, and he has a down look when spoken to. He had a Ticklenburg shirt and trousers, a fur hat much worn. He was purchased by the subscriber in Dorchester County, which is in Maryland. All masters of vessels and others are forewarned from harboring or carrying off said Negro at their peril, end quote. And then there's a listing of rewards that are offered. So what I'm interested in is how this fragment of newspaper operates in the archive more broadly as providing a complex interaction of Black presence. Both pieces of writing actually have the men in the foreground. An image and a narrative is created about them. This introduces us to the overwhelming perspective in the archive. To be Black is to be written about. Cuffey is the free man and the revered man. Mr. James Ambley, on the other hand, is the owned man. Both are given a social positioning in relationship to whiteness, which is the racial foreground. The story of Captain Cuffey further resonates with that of the circumstantially paired runaway ad of Mr. Ambley. The runaway ad, considered generally, is a descriptive ad of the physical and affective character of an escaped enslaved person. Here we see commentary on the appearance of Mr. Ambley's skin, as in it is affected by smallpox scars, on his affect as connected to his speech. He looks down when he is spoken to, which we might assume is a response to the power and disciplinary dynamics encoded in the communication between Mr. Ambley and his owner, who penned and paid for the ad. And the outfit he was last remembered to have worn, which we can read as coarse linen and a worn fur hat. As I mentioned earlier, the article on Cuffey concludes on his appearance. So that reads, Captain Cuffey is a very pleasing countenance, and his physiognomy truly interesting. He is both tall and stout, speaks English well, dresses in the Quaker style, in a drab-colored suit, and wears a large flapped white hat, end quote. Both men are physically examined in the pieces written about them, a state of Black being in America of any social status during that time. Their affect, appearance, speech, and outfits are of critical note and conveyance for the writer and reader, demonstrating not only description, but power and judgment in establishing hierarchy and proximities to whiteness. We also see that for Mr. Ambley, it is suspected that he could and perhaps did escape by sea via what has been called the Maritime Underground Railroad, or the waterway routes of escape from slavery, instead of terrestrial or overland routes, and that his owner was a shipbuilder, likely giving Ambley some knowledge in connection to maritime spaces. Captain Cuffey and Mr. Ambley are both connected to the sea and related water systems, with the aquatic as an understated space for Black American life and connection. With the purposeful inclusion of Captain Cuffy in the Nantucket archive, we also uncover an incidental inclusion of Black presence in the archive and the advertisement for Mr. Ambley, the inclusion of which clarifies and illuminates themes of Black American life. The pairing together amplifies inconspicuous themes of early Black American life, to be spoken of, to be physically read, and to occupy an alternative geographic space. So overall, more could be said about these newspaper clippings and really every object I'm going to look at, but I'm just going to offer a few things to think about for each one. So the second object I'll look at is a letter written by Phoebe Coleman Folger in 1829 to her brother, seemingly in response to a letter she had received from him. She writes from Eastern New York State, specifically Ghent, which is outside the city of Hudson, and her brother's address shows that he lived on Nantucket. It is a 2.5-page, pretty dramatic letter that begins with pleasantries. So this person is doing well, this person is fine, this person had a little cold, etc. And then it gets into the major part of the letter, which is the tragic suicide hanging of a girl by a skein of linen thread. And then the next paragraph, halfway through the letter, in the span of 2 sentences, describes a fatal incident, which is the part of the letter I'm going to focus on. And a warning that although the description is brief, it does have a graphic conclusion. So Coleman Folger writes, quote, "Jonathan Frary was killed as he was making soda water. I don't understand the process, but I heard he had 2 Negroes turning his machine. They told him it was charged high enough. They had been used to assisting him in that way and knew by that time they had been turning. But he said it was not, and told them to turn away. And in a few minutes, the receiver burst. It took off the greater part of his head. His brains were blown up against the ceiling," end quote. And then the letter immediately moves on to the most ubiquitous of context or topics, the weather. So she writes, it was hot, and then it was cold and dry, and then it was rainy. But returning to the vignette in a letter about the people and events in Phoebe Coleman Folger's life, though she heard from and heard about, is a story about a gruesome death from the making of soda water. The man in charge, who had a stated name, Jonathan Frary, thought he knew best how to make the water, how to produce the carbonation, and his assistants, who made the water consistently, seemed to have informed him that he was pushing the machines of the process too hard, too far, but he didn't listen to his own detriment and demise. The assistants, the laborers, those who supported him, knew best and were ignored, and of importance here is that they were African American. They were included as a sort of presence to the grand overview of the letter, but were of course critical to the soda shop in their labor, and importantly, in their knowledge. We can see that their advice, despite their expertise, was ignored to the mortal detriment of the one who regulated their labor. Local newspapers covered the event with article titles including "Melancholy Event" and "Shocking." The story outline generally follows that laid out by Miss Coleman Folger. Jonathan Frary, a druggist, overcharged a soda water fountain when it exploded, with a piece hitting his head and ending his life. The terms range in their detail of the incident and sanitation around the event of his getting hit by the projectile. Of note in a few articles is that there were alleged to have been 3 men who were assisting him, all of who were unharmed, and that there is never any mention of their race. When we look at the letter compared against the newspaper articles that were written about the incident, we actually gain some insider knowledge about the scene. Suddenly, the African American men are present, are knowledgeable, they have expertise, and they accrue aspects of an identity, though we still don't really know much. We don't know their names or who they really were. Their presence is given some space in the archive and in the historical record, though this space can still be limited and limiting. Still, they become essential to the story that is told in the letter, where they are otherwise, and other official retellings seemingly absent. And so glimpses of Black life, Black presence, however sparse, particularly in comparison to the names and details in the rest of Coleman Folger's letter, offer us the beginnings of seeing and sensing a Black story. The letter gives us a little, whether it's otherwise the nebulous in the newspapers. So we are offered something, even if it's not a lot. The next object to look at is a register of marriage licenses from Nantucket that were recorded from 1909 to 1932. In this book, we find glimpses of an into Black life. Though the marriages recorded in the book are all racially homogenous in their pairings, the book itself is actually racially integrated. So of the 82 recorded marriages, there are 11 marriages covering the racial range of Black and mulatto, showing that Black marriages on Nantucket occurred, but were semi-infrequent. We can see what people did on the island from these records, including holding positions as laborers, laundresses, cooks, domestics, maids, gardeners, barbers, chauffeurs. Many of the marriages were between people in their young 20s, with one 17-year-old and others in their upper 30s. We can also take note of where those who were married were born. So if they were born abroad, they were from Cape Thayer. Many US-born people came from cities, including Robert Daniel Higginbotham, who is from Trenton, New Jersey, and his wife, Florence Elizabeth Clay, who is from Richmond, Virginia. And since I have these people's names, I'm going to say them. Moses Idle Ford was from Chicago, and his wife, Flaxie Ledbetter, was from Washington, D.C. Francis H. Scott was from Brooklyn, New York. A few people were from smaller local cities, including New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island. A few also came from small towns, including from North Carolina, South Carolina, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, with only one individual, John Vieira, born on Nantucket. What we see in looking through the geographies, in particular of those who married on Nantucket in the early 20th century, is a collection of people who have found their way to the island almost entirely from elsewhere. Some places can be expected, New Bedford and Massachusetts more broadly, Providence and Cape Verde, acknowledging the long connection between the island of Nantucket and the island country. But we also see people coming from landlocked big cities to the island at what would have been the beginning of the Great Migration in America, where African Americans in the South migrated to the North, to big cities in particular, the same ones from which people came from before they came to Nantucket. But there's also Southern small town movement, such as by Clinsel Glenn, who was born in Chester, South Carolina, what actually remains a majority Black landlocked rural city, who then moved to Yonkers, New York, and eventually came to Nantucket to marry at 20. These records of marriage on Nantucket show us some mappings of movement that point to greater trends of Black migration during the early 20th century for Black Americans. So the few Black marriage records in the license book give us some information about who lived, even if for a time, on Nantucket and what they did there. But we can also use this information to conceive of how Nantucket related to larger trends in Black movement at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so next I will look at the early life story of Deborah Coffin Hussey Adams, as it was recorded in 1917 by her daughter in San Francisco. So Hussey Adams begins her life story by recalling that she was gratefully born and had a nice childhood in Nantucket before her family left when she was 12 to follow her father's job. In her recollection, we find two instances of presence, one of Native American presence and the second of Black presence. In the first instance, Hussey Adams described how families would travel to Sconset on Nantucket for parties. There was the great, quote, rivalry of the children as to who should first see the ocean, and the men at once went to shore to get fish for chowder, while the women set the table and laid out all the good things they got to eat. After the meal was finished, we children would be sent with the leavings to the hermit, an old Indian. He was a great mystery to us, and though we would not have missed going for the world, we were scared half to death. We clung together for safety, put the food down, and scampered away to join the crowd as fast as we could, end quote. Second, she writes, quote, on one of Father's visits to New Bedford, when I When I went with him, we stopped with William Gifford, one of the wealthy friends, as in a Quaker friend, living on beautiful County Street. I must have been 7 or 8 years old, for I could not fasten my dress behind. One day while in New Bedford, we dined with the Delanos, ex-Quakers or else very worldly ones. There was a large company at dinner. It was a very hot day, and a little Negro girl went around the table waving a palm leaf fan, almost as big as she was, so that every once in a while, we would get a refreshing whiff of air. Years later, the winter before I was married, I visited an old schoolmate in New Bedford. She was engaged to a relative of the Delanos, so it came about naturally that we dined with them. Again, I was sitting in the same dining room where I had watched the little Black girl circling the table with her fan. In this biography, 2 encounters of racial difference were vivid in the speaker's memory. The second case demonstrates the presence of a Black person, a girl, just like the writer herself at the time, remained with Hussey Adams as a ghostly presence when she returned to the same room as an adult in which she originally encountered the girl. And then both these memories, as a sort of double memory, were recalled in her late adulthood. In both early stories, from her visits to Sconset and New Bedford, we get glimpses of Native American presence and Black presence, points in her life of personal encounter that were so notable in their difference that they remained with her. What we may think of with this is that despite the racial diversity that is recorded to have been on Nantucket, Hussey Adams may not have had continuous interaction with people unlike herself. And when she did, these brief points of meeting, of sharing space, were and remain notable several decades later. We can see how presence is created. Black and Native American people were part of white memories, but they lacked a distinct identity and name. They were observed, a blip in a larger story. Hussey Adams later continues, quote, Nantucket was one of the stations of the Underground Railroad. The fugitive slaves sometimes came there under the protection of the Quakers. There was a Negro colony called Guinea, which we passed on the way to Sconset. Pro-slavery feeling too ran high. Cousin Eliza Barney and others were pelted with rotten eggs. Excuse me, I'm sorry. They were pelted with rotten eggs at an anti-slavery meeting. I remember we had to eat free labor sugar, which the slaves did not make, and nasty stuff it was. I don't know where it came from, end quote. And so what can be seen is a social and physical separation between the writer and the people of color on the island. And this also resonated in the discussions around slavery on the island. Even if Nantucket was a rhetorically or real safe space for escaped enslaved people, this was not a universal sentiment. And otherwise African American, in addition to Native American people on the island, were discussed as groups. And they were otherwise not so visible that their actual presence was unremarkable. Because as we can see from Hussey Adams' story, their individual existence was in fact notable. Next, I look at a recording of an interview from 1927 given by a man named Captain Joy. He was born in 1847. The interview covers his long career in working on ships, beginning when he was 10. His recollection of his travels finds him all over the world. In these travels, we hear the names and brief narratives of those who were with him, who he saw, who he talked to, and who he worked and sailed with. Mentioned twice by name, and then defined at the third mention as the solely identified Negro of his travels was Joe Louis, the cook and, quote, a good man. He was a good sailor and a good cook, and the captain didn't have any trouble with him, end quote. We can look to Joe Louis's presence in the position many Black sailors held, which was as a cook, to discern where he and other Black men working on ships might have traveled, as the mapping of the African American when he was abroad beyond the bounds of the United States, creating an expanded Black geography. Lewis's name appears in the context of several journeys that the captain discusses that include the locations of New York, San Francisco, Hong Kong, Antwerp, Belgium, Newcastle, the UK, Manila, Philippines, Zanzibar, Tanzania, and Sydney, Australia. In this geographic tracing, we can see that African Americans, through the example of Joe Lewis, traveled abroad and worked abroad, and were not necessarily confined to the boundaries of the United States. We can also think back to Captain Cuffy traveling to Sierra Leone and England. Lewis's travels in particular occurred during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, a time where restriction and spatial control were a point of constant debate and violence within the terrestrial space of the US, with spatial regulation often imposed with terroristic practices. Presence in this piece allows for an expanded perspective of where African American people could be found beyond the boundaries of America, and that they were at least temporarily in many countries on almost every continent. Lastly, I will look at a collection of found documents that illustrate the life of Vivian and Ellen Potter, who for some time resided on Nantucket. These documents are distinct compared to the previous materials and individuals I've introduced, and that the Potters, in a sense, are Black people who speak for themselves. So in these documents, we find many papers related to Mrs. Potter's career as a nurse and Dr. Potter's career as a dentist, and then an Army dentist. So the documents follow Mrs. Potter as she received her registered nurse license in 1929 in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, which was likely Cleveland, Ohio. Though she was originally from Winthrop, Massachusetts, and she trained in New York City at Lincoln Hospital. She then appeared to move to Buffalo, New York, and then to the Bronx. It is around this time when she marries Dr. Potter, who was previously of Fall River, Massachusetts, and who received his DDS, our Doctor of Dental Surgery, at Meharry Dental College, the HBCU in Tennessee. The Potters married at an AME church in Harlem. They could be found in Brooklyn, and then they either lived or Dr. Potter traveled to or was otherwise affiliated with Fort Dix, which is in New Jersey near Trenton. Dr. Potter became a Lieutenant Colonel Army dentist in 1953, which was 5 years after orders were given for the branches of the military to racially integrate, and around the time, if not actually a little bit before, the Army reported being fully integrated. Following the Second World War, Mr. and Mrs. Potter could be found in Yokohama, Japan, where they ran a military dental clinic and where Mrs. Potter additionally taught English. Before they left, they were located in Nantucket and then Roxbury, Mass, were later found back in Boston and the Everett before they returned to Nantucket. The documents of the Potters show the contrast in the archive. We have their diplomas and their wedding cards and corsages and home loans. We know where they lived and worked, and although the documents are overwhelmingly government documents, work documents, finance documents, and so on, as in their narrative or self-described story is not really there, there is more of a wholeness to their story. They seem to emerge more from the archive. And so overall, in looking at these documents from the Nantucket Historical Association archive, we can think about who is named and who is not, who holds narrative power and who the storyteller is, who is described and how, what interpretive work has to be done when we are only given a glimpse of someone, and what this all means for constructions and understandings of Black life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kayci. That was really great, showing us a few of the documents that you incorporated in your research and shedding light on that. All right, so now we will go through some of the questions that our attendees submitted. One of our guests asked, what is the difference in the marriage licenses between mulatto and Black?
So I think if I'm understanding, the mulatto in the marriage license was marked with an M and Black was marked with a B. And there was only one case, if I'm remembering correctly, that actually had a mixed marriage between a mulatto person and a Black person. And yes.
And the follow-up question is, did mulatto just cover anyone of mixed race, or was it a specific combination?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not actually sure, but yes, I have a similar thought, and it's definitely something to look at.
Could you elaborate on the pro-slavery sentiments on Nantucket, referring to the eggs that were pelted at Eliza Barney?
Yeah, I think in the archive, and I think as part of the self-narrative of Nantucket, the emphasis on abolition was much stronger and much more recorded in the archive than any pro-slavery sentiments. And so I actually think this is sort of a hidden narrative in the archive about who was pro-slavery and what actually the percentage was. There just seemed to be sort of hints that it was not a homogenous viewpoint. So yes, that's also a place where more research could be done.
Mm. And Kayci, when you arrived on Nantucket, were you expecting to find anything in particular at the NHA archive? And once you started digging through it, what was one of the most surprising findings?
When I originally came to Nantucket, I was really expecting to see a lot of information on Black maritime relationships. And I think what I was most surprised by were the sort of self-describing narratives on Nantucket from the whaling days into the present tourism days, and sort of, yeah, the continuity of Nantucket's self-image. I wasn't expecting that.
And another guest asked, do you know if there is any evidence of observance of the Emancipation Proclamation on Nantucket? Find that in any of your research?
Any evidence? That's a good question. This is not something I specifically looked for, but it could exist. I think there are some, again, in thinking about the collection of documents related to abolition, there was a strong anti-slavery group. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was excitement and interest in the Emancipation Proclamation, although slavery and enslavement practices ended earlier than when that document was produced. Yeah.
Mm. And we received a comment from an attendee. Just an interesting thing to note, the marriage license for Florence Clay Higginbotham is interesting for another reason. Her house is on the same parcel as the African Meeting House on Nantucket in New Guinea. Both are part of a museum.
Great.
Thanks
Yeah.
for sharing that. One of our attendees.
Yes,
And
thank you.
Kayci, do you mind elaborating on your PhD research and how your findings at the NHA were incorporated in that and how it fits in with that broader scope?
Sure. So underlying theme of my PhD research and research generally is sort of on this notion of subtle violences and how this manifests in different landscapes, and specifically through violences that follow, Black life anywhere in America. And I think the things that I did find in Nantucket, so thinking about this notion of presence and thinking about the sort of hidden undercurrent of Black life relates to my work and contributes to my work, because it's this idea of what does it mean when you have to look very closely, very specifically to understand who exists and what sort of violences contribute to this hiddenness, this sort of like camouflaging, intentional or not, of Black life in America.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Feel free to type it in the Q&A. Oh, someone asked, why did you choose Nantucket?
Sure. I chose Nantucket because it is a distinct place for thinking about these alternative geographies of Black life, specifically thinking about Nantucket as an island, as a place connected to whaling, to maritime trade, to, yes, this sort of alternative bounds where Black people are not necessarily expected to be, but where they actually were. And so, yeah, I think the sort of alternative geography standpoint of Nantucket is really important.
And you mentioned the Underground Railroad. How strongly did residents, both Black and white, contribute to the efforts, and how did they help escapees?
Yeah, this is a good question. So again, it was a little bit hard for me to discern exactly how continuous and intentional directed efforts of the Underground Railroad were in Nantucket. And I think that's true in thinking about the Underground Railroad more broadly, right? Because it was such a diffuse network. It was not as organized as media representations like to portray it as. And so in the archive, there are little hints and defenses of Black freedom, but like many sort of recollections of the Underground Railroad in the American North, these individual instances sort of are more profound than perhaps they were, or become sort of mythologized. So in some ways, it's kind of difficult to say.
And someone is wondering if you had time to visit the historic colored cemetery on Nantucket when you were here.
I did, yes. I feel like I have a huge chunk in my camera photo roll from going to the cemetery. Yeah, it was a great experience. And just seeing all the collections of families like the Boston family spread throughout the cemetery and together was, yeah, really exciting to see.
Oh, great. Will you move on to Martha's Vineyard for comparisons?
Excellent question. I think there is such a big, I think there's a inclination to think of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard sort of together, sister islands, but the Black life on each island was so distinct. So yes, I think it's almost natural to want to move on to this other island and think about just the comparison aspect of these two places that could be very similar, but are not.
Do you have any future plans to visit the archive on Nantucket again? Are you looking for more material, or have you collected all that you wanted for this portion of your dissertation?
Yeah, I think that's the tricky part of collecting any information from any archive, is because especially Nantucket's is so big. There's so much information for a place that is really, I mean, geographically quite small. So I've collected what I could in the time that I was there, which is 3 weeks, but I think you could spend an unknown amount of time trying to collect material and comb through everything. So there's definitely room to go back. Yeah, and mysteries, some, of these brought up in the questions that can still be solved with or at least looked into via the archive.
Did you happen to look at the West family archives? Someone is asking.
No, I'll have to look into that. I'll write that down.
Yeah, and we received another comment that there's more information about the Black population on Nantucket under archives for the 19th century.
Great. Okay.
Another question. So Nantucket obviously has a rich Black story, whalers, free people, self-freed Black people. Why do you think the story holds such mystique?
Yeah. I think one reason is just the general, um, not lack necessarily, but sort of um, the missing elements, the like few continuous stories of Black life throughout the 18th, 19th, early 20th century. And I think that Nantucket, in its interest in forming its whaling history, in having a discussion about free people, formerly enslaved people who became free, it offers sort of this unique perspective and draw from an American history that is otherwise very violent and violently hidden. And so that this is a place where this information has sort of lived, and is part of the Nantucket story. It has a draw for thinking about like, what is Black life beyond, the slavery South? What is Black life in the North? Yeah.
Now, tell us about your research process. What is required to be allowed to use the archives on Nantucket? I can answer that, but I'll let our speaker address that. And did you request specific documents ahead of time, or you just opened up folders and made some discoveries?
So I had an idea of what I wanted to research, and the library has a really great search tool that I use to see exactly what sort of boxes of materials I wanted to look through. And I sent those requests to the librarian and also set up time and day, in my case, a few weeks, to go to the library. And as I was there, there are different threads that come through. So I would look for related materials and find those out. But yeah, if you wanted to add anything, Jocelyn, as an employee of the NHA.
No, that's great. And I just want to make an announcement that the research library is undergoing some renovation. So we actually are closed now until likely the end of the year. So if you really would like to access materials, you'll have to email library@nha.org and make a special request. All right. Another question, why do you think the Quaker Black story is so intertwined?
I think the relationship between Quakerism and Blackness is intertwined because Quakerism and the abolition Underground Railroad movement in America has been also very thoroughly mythologized. But it is true that, it was, although some Quakers did own enslaved people, eventually it became a tenet that they were abolitionists, or they did not believe that people should be enslaved. So I think there's just a strong historical thread in terms of belief systems. And then it also just joins in this really alluring story of the Underground Railroad.
What other archival research topics related to Nantucket's African American history will you like to see future researchers conduct?
Oh, um, Let me think about this.
Or perhaps these are topics that you would like to undertake in the future.
No, I mean, I think there's just so many, I think the research topic I want to maybe frame differently, which is like, what sort of interpretations can we begin to form from the materials that have been uncovered? Because I think there's, again, like a strong, as someone wrote in their question, mystique around Blackness on Nantucket. What other sort of interpretations can be formed around Black life? I think that would be really interesting.
Hmm. Did you research the Newtown section of Nantucket?
Newtown. No, unless that's the Guinea section, New Guinea. But yeah, I didn't really see Newtown.
This is great. We're getting plenty of suggestions from the audience here.
Yeah.
And our final question, did you go into any other institutional archives for this specific topic, and how would you compare the material that you were looking at those other places to the NHA's research library?
Yeah, I've been to a few archives, and I think what is so interesting about the NHA's archive is it's well, there are a lot of things that are interesting. I mean, from an organizational standpoint and like a yeah, sort of functional standpoint, it's very organized. But from
We love to hear that.
I think the amount of materials for such a small place is so notable. There is a real sense of like historical development and establishment on the island that I thought maybe existed, but was really surprised to see it how profoundly Nantucket takes its, how profoundly it takes its own history and how seriously it takes its history. Yeah, it's really, really interesting.
Mm. And we actually had a few questions come in just in the last minute. Did Frederick Douglass cross your research path?
Yeah, so I think that is a, a point of note, and it seems Nantucket's historical trajectory is like the note of Frederick Douglass coming. And in fact, when you walk into the NHA archives, there's a bust of him noting that he had been to this meeting house. Yes, so I think sort of like the Underground Railroad mystique that you can sort of try and track this, you know, where is there, where is it? There's also sort of this trend of like, where was Frederick Douglass in North America or in the Northern US? And yes, indeed, he came to Nantucket, and indeed it is noted.
Mm. And in those few times that you've visited Nantucket, how would you describe what you observed in terms of the current integration or lack thereof between Black and white people on the island?
Mhm. I think something notable in the current state of Nantucket as a sort of place of submarine, of tourism, is that there is now sort of like a different composition of who is Black on the island. So there are people from the Caribbean who have come to work on the island, and you know, the labor on the island is very distinct and different from necessarily who goes there to vacation. And so I think in a sense, we're talking about a different sort of integration than the integration we would talk about in 1800 or 1900 or even, you know, like 1970. It's Nantucket, like most places, but especially as a place of tourism, has seen a lot of racial change.
Mm. And our last question, when can we expect to see your dissertation published? And when next will you be delivering a speaking engagement?
So when will my dissertation be published? Excellent question. The long turning cycles of academia and academic publishing. I hope it's finished in about a year and a half or so. But
So
yes,
we've got some time to wait.
unfortunately, all of us do, myself included, yes. And my next speaking engagement right now is not until, that's a good question. January of next year is when I have it planned, but yeah, looking for more if anyone needs a speaker. Just kidding.
All right. Well, thank you again, Kayci, for sharing about your research and shedding light on some of those really interesting discoveries that you made in the NHA Research Library. Thank you to our online guests for joining us this evening. And thank you to our NHA members for making these free public programs possible. I also want to thank the Tuppence C. Harris Foundation for generously supporting these programs.